afternoon.
Okay, great. So we're going to begin. It is my tremendous honor to be with you here this afternoon to talk about StoryCorps. Personally, longtime fan, and it's a privilege to be up here with everybody. So first, Patty DeVary, archivist extraordinaire at StoryCorps. So she's one of the people who make sure that none of this gets lost.
Exactly.
So she's the archivist. And then we have Emily Jansen, who is the Director of Learning and Engagement at StoryCorps. So you're here to oversee all this. And if you wonder why, one of the reasons why this panel at this conference is that EVN Media, our wonderful organizers of this festival, is having a StoryCorps booth. So as we talk about this, you can go downstairs. You can go either staircase here or around the corner. Go downstairs, there's a recording booth, and you can record your stories. Now, what does that mean? What does that entail? Well, we're about to tell you what that all means, what that all entails, and I cannot think of a better way to do it than by example. So, Ani, if you wish, if everyone could just close your eyes, maybe look away from your phone, and just listen to the audio of this piece. I think it'll begin to convey what StoryCorps is all about.
It's Friday, which means it's time again for StoryCorps. Today, memories of a tough Metzmama, that's Armenian for grandmother. Isabel Kuyumjan was born in a refugee camp. Her parents fled the area we now know as Turkey around 1915. They were escaping the Armenian genocide, which killed nearly 1.5 million people. Isabel eventually immigrated to the U.S. and raised 2 generations before she died a year ago. One of her granddaughters, Joanne Nuko, came to StoryCorps with her husband to remember her grandmother.
My grandmother was a large woman, but on the shorter side. She just was kind of round. She did not have much formal education, but spoke and read 5 languages. She was very sweet and loving to me, but she had this really tough streak.
What's one of the stories that conveyed her toughness to you?
One incident I remember, we were kids, and there was a lizard in the backyard. My younger sister saw it and screamed, so my grandmother picked it up and broke it in half with her bare hands. And it was a mixture of being horrified, but also really impressed. I just thought she was like a superhero. She didn't smile much. She kind of had a permanent scowl, and I didn't know where it came from. But I heard stories about how she raised 2 kids by herself. And, so much of her ways of seeing the world were really bound up with knowing the ground could fall out from beneath you at any moment, and that she would weather whatever storm.
You had a very close relationship with her. That wasn't just grandmother and granddaughter.
Yeah, she was my best friend. That last week when she was dying, I just kept telling her, it's okay to go. You've done your work. You don't have to fight this if you don't want to. And I miss the little things like speaking Armenian with somebody, not something I do very often anymore. I miss feeling like there's this one person who really believes in me. It's something I'm trying to do for myself, but nobody else could convince me the way that she could. And there isn't really a replacement for that.
Joanne Nuko and her husband, Jeff Ono, remembering her grandmother, Isabel Kuyumjan, at StoryCorps in Claremont, California. Their recording is archived, along with thousands of others, at the American Folklife Center in the Library of Congress.
It's a beautiful piece. It captures so much, and for those of you who are looking at your watch, it clocks in at under 3 minutes. This particular piece, to set it up a little bit more, broadcasts in America on National Public Radio. So it was designed to be heard by an American audience, I'm sure if you were to rebroadcast it here in Armenia, you'd have a different language, a different text going into the piece. But what you're hearing is actually just the tip of the iceberg. So we heard about 2 minutes of interview, but in reality, that interview could have run anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour-ish. So tell us, Emily,
Yes.
when you make a piece like this, when you sit down with a family, and it's not just, you've interviewed more than just Armenian families. You've interviewed war veterans, people who were involved in the civil rights movement. You've been trying to interview elderly people and have family members talk with them before they lose their memory and Alzheimer's kicks in. So, and a whole range of people. So as you're doing these stories, tell us how a StoryCorps piece, the traditional StoryCorps piece, happens.
Yes. So when we heard the two of them talking to one another, we can picture this. So we at StoryCorps invite people to come in conversation together. So we're saying the word interview, but actually StoryCorps is not inviting you to interview you, but to come together and have that conversation and ask each other questions. So the two people come together, and imagine they're sitting at a table across from one another with those microphones, and in the corner is someone that we call a facilitator from StoryCorps, and they're there to help make that conversation happen, take care of the technical aspects, really be the first witness to that conversation, to help archive it, to help listen, to bring stories into the world. And so that conversation goes for 40 minutes, typically. And those two people use that time to ask each other the questions that they want to ask, to remember the things that they want to remember. And then when they're done, we make sure they have a copy of it for their own legacy and memory. And then they can choose to share that with us, a very generous gift, so that we can archive it at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and we can use it to bring the stories into the world.
And so in this case, this piece, from what I gather, it's about 1% or so of all interview sessions, very small percent, might make it from the archives, from the Library of Congress, into a more produced piece like this that you would hear for wider broadcast. So how do you go about that selection process?
I think the first part is that facilitator is the first listener, and not every piece makes a StoryCorps style. These 3 minutes is very specific. And the heart of it, why I think that we feel so compelled and connected, is because we hear the relationship between the two people. That's part of what's happening. We hear that energy, that the relationship, the investment that they have in one another. That's very different than if someone else was interviewing them. So sometimes we say when we're doing it, we're listening for sparks, like when you feel and hear when someone's really talking about something that matters to them, and they're descriptive, and we can see and smell and hear things, and where we can feel connected to them. So of course, I mean, it's a big process to go from 40 minutes to 3 minutes, but we're sort of flagging in that way. When you feel and hear it, that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, there's something descriptive and rich, and you feel connected to the people.
And in America, we have these the saying for a really good radio piece, the driveway moment where you just stay in your car, you don't get out, you don't want to miss the next bit. So I did not tell you which piece I was going to be bringing up here. As you listened to this, what struck you?
I mean, I think it sounds, I feel really lucky. I've gotten to be that witness for over 500 conversations sitting in the room. And what I hear is what I hear all the time. I mean, it's authenticity, it's connection, it's memory, it's love, love for her grandmother, love. Yeah, that's what comes through to me. And there are some stories I've heard so many times I've played, and I will cry every time, or I'll hear something different. In those 3 minutes, I'll hear a completely different, something that strikes me in a new way every time.
And just so people are clear, this was one StoryCorps piece that talked about Armenia, but I know that within the archive there are at least 20 other interviews that discuss various parts of Armenian life, American Armenians in the diaspora, other aspects of Armenia. So, Patty, why don't you tell us a little bit about archiving so we can listen to these pieces on National Public Radio. We can hear these, beautifully produced with little intro and outro music and a good narrator setting it up. But there are many other interviews that are just sitting there, running 40 minutes longer. You're archiving them. So tell us about how that works, the archiving system.
Sure. I did a similar search to you today. Actually, I went into our website, archive.storycorps.org, and I thought to myself, how might you search for Armenian stories? So I did the simplest thing I could think of. I typed in Armenia in the search box, and I got about that many interviews. That's one way you can search our website. We have faceted searches. There's like a location search, so you could find that keyword Armenia or other locations. I can do sort of deeper searches because we have more access to the data than the public does. We ask our participants for birth country and birthplace, for example, so I could do a search for anyone who might be in our archive who was born in Armenia. And so how that process works, how we get that information, is when people come into our booth, they have the option of providing demographic information for us. They can tell us, like I said, about where they were born, their religious affiliations, their gender preferences, and part of why we ask those questions is so that we can make sure that our archive looks and sounds like the demographics of the United States, which is primarily what our archive is representing. And all of those all of that is also optional. We want that information for those purposes, but we also want to give people autonomy over what they're sharing with us. And then our facilitators, as Emily was describing them, while they're listening to these interviews and recording them, they're taking notes so they can mark the places that are mentioned, the people that are mentioned, the themes and the keywords that come up, and they can describe those interviews later in our archive so that then you can come to the website and search for Armenia and find those stories.
And so everyone from archivists, anthropologists, journalists, they can come and avail themselves of searching it. It's at the Library of Congress. Mm-hmm. Why don't you tell people a little bit more about how the Library of Congress works and that it's public and
Sure.
available?
The Library of Congress is the People's Library of America, and our collection specifically is housed in the American Folklife Center, so that's archiving and cataloging folk materials, so it's music and story, a lot of storytelling, folk art that's not necessarily considered fine art. But yes, anyone can come and sign up for a researcher's library card. And specifically, if you want to listen to your StoryCorps interview, you can go to the Folklife Center and make an appointment. And they'll pull up that interview for you, and you can sit there in this grand space that houses our nation's memories and listen to your interview. Or if you know that your grandparents did an interview 20 years ago, which is how old StoryCorps is, how long we've been recording, you can listen to their interview.
And so the public can go, and there's the public-facing collection. Mm-hmm. And for here in Armenia, for now, the trove will be stored by EVN Media, and then I imagine in the months or years ahead, you'll sort out how that might be shared further.
Yeah, what we're recording during this festival, EVN will own. It will be their collection, and we're in talks with how that might be added or future collaborations with StoryCorps.
Right. So, Emily, you're talking about a facilitator, right? Now, so this is a room that has journalists, people of different persuasions, different professions, and you're talking about a facilitator. So that sounds kind of vague. So walk us through a little bit more what a facilitator does.
Yeah, that's a great question. Also, I sometimes say, because when you say the word facilitator, that means a lot of different things for a lot of different people and a lot of different professions. So that person is really there to hold the space for the conversation and help the participants get from beginning to end and make that the best experience for them, but also to make sure that it's archived well and to be that first listener when we think about how are we listening for story. And so part of that really has to do with welcome and hospitality and preparation. When people come into the room or even before, what do you expect? What's happening here? What are we doing? What's gonna happen over the next hour when we're together? And reassuring them, giving them some tools to say, you're gonna sit and have this conversation together. Maybe here's some questions that you might like if you haven't already brought your own. And a little encouragement. So often we are saying, these are usually people come, they're not folks who are used to doing what you're doing here, interviewing us or talking on a microphone, and that can be intimidating. So there's a lot of reassurance along the way to say, we're here to have a conversation. You have conversations every day in your life, I presume. You're a curious person, and this recording we're not live on a stage. We're not on the radio right now. We're just two people sitting down and having a conversation like you might have at dinner. And that means it's not gonna sound perfect from beginning to end. Like even if you've heard those 3-minute stories, no one told that story so beautifully and perfectly from minute 1 to 3 minutes. You're gonna have that conversation and you are gonna sound exactly how you sound. All of us, we forget things, we interrupt each other. Maybe you'll say, all of that's gonna happen, and that's what's beautiful because we sound exactly how we are. So there's a reassurance of what's happening. And then on the other end, as Patty said, while the conversation is happening, they're technically recording it, so being the person who knows what to do with the microphone, all of those things, and recording that sort of mentally recording that for the archive. But the final thing is that, and this is the nuanced art of facilitating at StoryCorps, which is you're there to help that story happen. And so sometimes you jump in and you might ask a follow-up question or ask a next question. And the art is knowing when to jump in to do that and sort of help that, and when to step back and let the story go where it goes. And then finally, just logistically, it's after the conversation at StoryCorps, after we've had that, we've recorded it, we're done, everyone thanks one another, where we ask the question, do you want to share that with us and with our archive? So we ask for that sort of consent at the end after someone's already said what they need to say. So the facilitator is, again, just taking us through that whole journey.
And I would imagine some of the follow-up questions might be, we've all sat at another family's dinner table, and that family has a conversation. We'll be like, wait, where's this starting? What are they talking about? Wait, what year roughly is this? Because they're starting the story because they know the story, or they're continuing a part of the story. And for the outsider, you're like, I'm coming in here midstream and I'm lost.
Yeah, I often say also, if people know each other, they're talking about people or places that they can picture themselves. So they know the place that they're talking about, they know what it looks like, they know who Uncle John is. I don't know who that is. And so, yeah, sometimes we have to help them paint the picture for us so that we can know, what does that person look like? What are you talking about? Paint the picture for us.
And still, you're encouraging your facilitators to, if you're going to err, to lean away from the microphone as much as you can.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in my years of facilitating, a lesson that I learned over time was to pause and surrender a little bit. And so if I had the impulse to jump in and ask a question. Before I actually do that, I need to pause and ask, why am I asking the question? Who is the question for? Like, is it for my morbid curiosity and I'm just very excited about this? Or is it because I can't wait to hear you get to this part of the story? So that's a lesson I learned. Everyone has a different style, but to say, give it some time, because often if I wait, they get where I wanted them to go, or I was curious about. They just might tell the story in a different order or a different way. Or it might take them a little bit longer to ask the question that they want to ask in their own words. But I feel like you might be coming to this. When I do that, I often wait in my style towards the end. Like, this conversation has been happening, and then I say, great, we've been having this conversation for 40 minutes. Can you tell me more about your grandfather? Just paint a picture, like describe him for me, or can you tell me more about this? So kind of let them have that experience together and then start to dig in a little bit. That's my style, but I think everyone has a slightly different version.
And you, as you were saying earlier, you've handled about 500 interviews or stories. Do you call them interviews even? Do you even
I feel like we used to say that all the time, and then it creates a misconception. So I say conversation a lot.
Okay, so
the conversations, the recording.
You have facilitated 500 conversations or so, and that means that there are others within StoryCorps who are doing this. Mm-hmm. And all trained?
Yeah, we have an intensive training at the beginning, and what I love about the group of facilitators that come in is that it tends not to be professional journalists or media makers. It's folks who are coming who are curious, empathetic, non-judgmental people who like to know about other people, and we can train them on how to use a microphone. We can train them on how to listen for good sound. We can train them on that. It's very difficult to train people on empathy. And so those are the people that we invite and bring in. So they come from, sometimes from social work professions, they're writers, they're any number of things, and they go on to do all of those things too. So usually it's a shorter stint, a year or two, and they do that work, and then they take all of that deep knowledge and listening with them into their next roles, whatever it is that they do.
So if I were a facilitator, I saw that you had some tips to help encourage a conversation. Mm-hmm. Tell me more.
That's a good question. I'm like, what are our tips?
So tell me more was one of them.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, yes. So sometimes I call them, some people have heard me say this actually this week. I call them back pocket questions, but when I was a facilitator, we used to have some of them just taped on the desk, sort of a crutch. I know I want someone to say something more, but I just need a little script for myself. And so, yes, those are questions like, tell me more. Mm-hmm. And then what happened? How did that make you feel? Can you paint a picture for me in words? What does that mean for you? Like, why was this important? And the other thing I'll just say to this is that one of our producers once said to me that people are typically very good at telling the fact part of stories or very good at emotionally reflecting on their stories. And often we have to help them do the other side of that. So someone might just say, just be telling you all of the emotional part, but you're like, what? Wait. What's the story? Wait, what happened? I need something to hold on to here. They need us to ground them in some sensory details. And so those are the folks I like to say, wait, and then what happened? Tell me something about what it looked like, what it sounded like. And then other people are very good at telling you the A, B, C, in chronological order, exactly what happened. And you're like, oh, but what does it mean? Like, why is that important? How did you feel? And you need to infuse that. So you need to ask them more questions about how they felt or what it means. So we're just helping them to balance out their tendencies.
And I can see that advice working not just in a StoryCorps setting, but for everyday journalists as well, or anthropologists, that you may it's interesting that you see that kind of divide between the people who are more factual, chronological, or fact specific, and others who are more emotional. So you had some of the other ones on your website.
Yes, thank you.
Look at the storyteller's eyes, not the microphone. You
Oh, yes, yes, yep.
Yep. Be yourself, laugh, cry. I think we've laughed a little bit. I have to admit I got a little misty-eyed listening yet again to that piece we began with.
StoryCorps is a place where you cry in professional settings.
Really?
We cry a lot. We cry a lot at work.
But Patty, you guys
Yes.
even advise people to bring to the interview
Tissues. We have branded tissues.
You have branded tissues.
We do a good job.
Yes.
Wow.
I have them in our institutional archive.
You have archived the tissues.
I have archived the tissues.
Wow, it's like Elvis's sweat on a handkerchief.
They're not used. It's unopened package.
Great. So you have, and so you're encouraging people to laugh or cry, to bring out emotions, and then asking emotional questions. How do you feel? And then also to be curious and honest. So, Patty, as you go back and listen to interviews, do you sometimes sit there and go like, they weren't honest enough, they weren't curious enough, there was something they were holding back on, and you wonder what that was?
That's a good question. I will be honest. I don't get the chance to listen to a lot of the full-length interviews because we do such a volume. We process about 200 interviews a month. That's not just me. There was a time when it was just me. Thankfully, now I have 2 archivists, and we're all working on it together. But I definitely have those moments as I'm checking the audio or checking the descriptive work that our facilitators do, where I want to listen to part of it, so I'll click through, and there is that moment where you can think, oh, I wish the facilitator had asked that follow-up question, and you're not in the room, so you don't know why that didn't happen. That not asking that question in the moment might have been more supportive for the participants than supportive of the interview.
It's interesting, though, if I can interject, Andy, that that feeling sometimes is when folks have come and had that interview, and then our producers who think about how to bring the story into the world, they might listen. So the facilitator might have said, I hear something here, there's a story, and share that with our producers, and they listen, and they have that feeling. Like, I feel the story here, I feel the connection, and they didn't ask this question, or it's not quite there. And then they invite those participants to come again and give them a little bit more support. Maybe think about coming back with a different interview partner who maybe they had that conversation with their coworker, but really, what if you came in with your mom and talked about that? And then they're able to sort of, you've had one conversation, let's do it again. And here's some more of that support and some more questions to help us hear the rest of that story. So they do have that, where I need to know more. We don't have it.
So a select few can double dip and go back to it. So will the facilitator at that point really be listening to this can be really good radio, this can be really good disseminated to a wider audience, I need to make sure we hit these points?
That's part of the listening and the balance of, Patty just said, how do we make sure this is first and foremost, a really supportive and positive experience for the people having the conversation, but you're simultaneously listening for that story, so that when you think, do I jump in and ask this question, often it's to round that out. It's to say, we got almost all the way through the story, but I don't actually know how it ended, so I need to ask that question. Or I have all of the facts, but I need to know that we have the meaning to it. So they're listening with that ear to figure out, should I jump in and ask another question?
Now, you both come from non-journalistic backgrounds.
Indeed.
You studied sociology and anthropology. You studied library sciences, have your master's in library sciences. So what what was it about StoryCorps that you saw lacking in the journalism firmament that you were thinking certain stories are not being told, certain stories are not being told in a way that could reach a certain audience? What was that genesis origin point?
Do you want to go or do you want me to go?
Our Genesis origin point?
Like personally or StoryCorps?
For StoryCorps, that
Oh,
that because you don't, we're not talking about a
Right.
traditional newsroom, and you yourselves do not have that traditional newsroom background. It's so how do you see yourself fitting in that media journalism landscape?
I mean, I think that we run parallel to it. And when we think about the first thing is, and even sort of in the origin and the genesis of StoryCorps, like the origins and where did we begin, our founder was a audio documentarian, and one of the stories that he did, it's called Ghetto Life 101, if you want to look it up, but he had been going around doing documentaries and interviews for a long time, standing here interviewing you. And in this case, he handed the microphone over to two 13-year-old boys who lived in the projects in Chicago, gave them the tips, and they were in their neighborhood, they were in their apartment building, asking their family questions, asking their neighbors questions. And this piece came out of that. And I think that is one of the deep parts of the origin, which is if I don't have to be a professionally trained interviewer or someone who has that sort of title and power in order to get that story, that all of us have that in us, and we all can sort of be given the tools to do that. And so I think that's sort of where it began. How can we bring two people together to say, you can ask the questions? And because of it, we get this much more intimate space that allows us to create stories where we feel really connected emotionally to people. And those 3-minute pieces that we've been hearing or we've been talking about is like this intense close-up. We've zoomed really far in and created a portrait of one person and their memories and their stories, or two people as they talk about that. So that does not give room for lots of context. That gives room for sort of like, I came in and I saw you as a human and I feel connected to that. And I've been thinking a lot about this as we sat here, sort of, the story is what brings you in and connects you, and I say, I want to know more. I feel like the details that you're saying are so far away from me, but the heart is the same. I know what it means to love. So in the context, I'll say this, in the context of EVN or, I'll shout out, we're the country of dust. We were listening, we were talking about this, but to say, that's a space where we get to experience context. Where someone like me coming here, I need to know the context. I need all of that extra. StoryCorps zooms so close and says, this is a human, and I think that can carry us to a space where other medium or other distributors or spaces can give us all of the context, and it has more meaning to me because I have a human connection to it.
And part of what you were saying earlier about the young kids in Chicago is the thought behind it is that they'll get conversations and they'll get people to say things that if a journalist came in with big microphone, with fuzzy thing on top, speaking of microphones, with fuzzy thing on top, that would be awkward.
Yeah, or you speak to your audience, we're all doing it now. You know who it is. And you'll ask different questions, and the person will tell you different things. Yeah, exactly.
So Patty, we were talking about archiving.
Yeah.
And in our last 10 minutes before we get to questions, one of the things that I found really interesting talking with you is that those of us who are journalists here in the audience, those of us who perhaps are in other professions, pursuits, whether things where you interview people or not, we all compile stuff photographs, documents, audio, video, maybe just our own family stuff, right? And you deal with stuff. You've dealt with stuff at the New York City Department of the Environment. You have all of this stuff, right? So help journalists here who've maybe been working on that long piece and they've accumulated too much stuff. Help us better organize and archive our material.
It's a big ask, but I love it. I think immediately don't panic, because as you just said, we're all in that same situation, and in any archive, there are boxes and boxes of things that they also haven't gone through. But I think the first thing to start with is maybe the immediate project that you're working on, and create as comprehensive an inventory as you can of those materials. And whatever information you have, you can use anything as simple as Google Sheets or Excel. We use Google Sheets. Archives use simple tools, just like we can use very complex ones, but we can use very simple ones. What kind of material is it? Is it an interview? Is it a photograph? What story is it for? Maybe what publication? And most importantly, I think, keywords, topics that it's about, because this material that you're using might be about the subject of this article that you're doing right now, but it also might cover these other topics, and you can return to that material and use it for something else. As far as organization of your files, whatever makes the most sense to you. I think keeping them sort of by project makes sense to me, but I'm not a journalist. We have our files organized by the team that records them. So our mobile team files are in one folder, and our national team files are in one folder. Our production team files are in one folder. So however that organization makes sense to you, and it's never too late to start.
But also, so you're mentioning teams. I could imagine a newsroom here in Yerevan is covering issues going on in ArtSoc. They might very well have more than one person covering that. So first off, you're giving permission to use a Google Drive.
I am.
But you're also saying that to maybe, it sounds like also to maybe have teams talk, the journalists, people to talk with one another to say, look, I've been archiving interviews. I have interviews from the past. I want you to be able to access this, because I may be out in the field doing something else, and so. Definitely,
I mean that cross referencing is super useful. I don't know why I imagined like a lone freelance journalist doing this, but certainly in an organization, absolutely. This article that I found, or this interview that I did, covers these topics, and I'm going to put that in our shared spreadsheet. Maybe I have my own Google Sheet for my own materials, but I can pop this into the shared spreadsheet, and I can look to see that, somebody else is found an article that actually I was looking for. I can reach out to them to use that article as well.
And we were talking about before this about so you have keywords that you're making sure are tagged to your material, metadata essentially.
Yes.
And then, but we're also talking about transcripts, and you were saying that you're finding Whisper as a generally good AI tool for so why don't you talk about translation services, because we as journalists are always looking for help.
Whisper right now anyway is what archives and libraries are looking to use. It's open source, and actually I can't vouch for how good or comprehensive it might be, but there are several languages, and Armenian is listed as one of the languages. So I know that I was talking to one of the EVN interns who had been doing oral histories, and she was like, oral histories, because she spent a lot of time transcribing them, and in Armenian, and at the time was doing it by hand. So I was very happy to see that Armenian was listed as a language on Whisper. I checked some of my other options that might go to, and they weren't there. So for that reason alone, I certainly would recommend checking it out to this group. You can also run it locally on your own servers, so you don't have to upload any data to OpenAI.
And And the translations may be imperfect, but it's certainly a huge time saver.
Yeah, especially for languages that may not have been available before. But I looked at some examples. My archivist Sunny was doing. She tested a Google transcript that we had of an interview and ran it through Whisper, and just within the first few minutes, it got last names correct. It got like a nickname. Google thought it was banana, but the nickname was actually panana, which banana is a normal word, so it made sense to me that in English that Google would pick that up, but Whisper was able to hear the P versus the B sound.
Sounds like it's a better listener. I open up my drawer of reporting tools, from NBC, from the New York Times, and there are ancient recording devices and ancient cameras and, things that, seem state of the art at the moment,
Yeah.
And even you guys came of age in the digital age, but even within the digital age, file types,
Yeah.
and the machinery that we've all been using has changed drastically. What challenges does that pose for you as an archivist?
This is actually something we're tackling this summer. From our founder Dave Isay's earlier project, Sound Portraits, that StoryCorps was actually an offshoot of. We have a bunch of DAT tapes, like 2,000 of them. So they've been inventoried by previous interns, and this summer we're going to start digitizing them. I was at a sound recording conference just last week in Minneapolis, and DAT tapes, especially if you have them, they're very finicky. They're very prone to issues if they're dirty. If you have any that are concerning to you, I would send them to someone who is an expert. Luckily, ours are in good shape, so that's something that we can handle on site. But I wouldn't we had reel-to-reels from that time as well. Those we don't have the expertise or equipment to digitize. We sent those off to an expert to have done. And I will say, for your equipment, if you still have it, keep it. Maybe try to sell it, because parts are needed. If the machine doesn't work, some of the parts might still.
So in other words, even though everything is digitized, that's a changing thing.
Oh,
what,
yeah.
What is digitized is changing. So we have a few more minutes before we get to questions. Two things I wanted to go over is, we've talked about the traditional StoryCorps story with a facilitator and two people, but there are other ways that people maybe they want to have a story, but they're not going to make it to the StoryCorps booth, or they just want to do it themselves. So you have apps, you have other tools. Why don't you tell us quickly about those?
Yeah, amazing, because this archive is available to contribute to. So a number of years ago, we created an app you can download to your phone. Essentially turns your phone into a recording device, walks you through the entire process, and when you're finished, you can choose to directly share that into StoryCorps' archive. Or if you already have a device that you record on, you could create a free account on our archive website and just directly upload those, if you have the permission to do that, so that you can do that. And what's amazing is, in that time, since we've had those tools, our archive has grown by hundreds of thousands
Yes.
of stories, and we're getting to hear people from more places that StoryCorps is not, including internationally, more young voices. I would say it's just a really beautiful way that we've democratized our archive even more.
Well, that's interesting that you're getting more young voices as well, because that's always, people in larger media organizations worry about not being able to reach a younger audience. It's great to hear that you're doing that. Patty, one last question before we go to question and answer. So you have this massive archive.
Yes.
There we go. And you have this massive archive, and so there's the public-facing version. Type in Armenia, get about 20 results. But then there's the private-facing version that researchers, journalists, other people might be able to request information from that may be of use.
Yeah.
So tell us, is that like a quarter of the collection? Tell us a little bit about what that collection looks like that's kind of off the interwebs.
Sure. It's on the interwebs. It's just not available to you. But part of the reason for that is that before 2019, our archive was an internal archive. It was first it was a FileMaker database, and then it was a proprietary database. It would be available to staff only and maybe some researchers, as well as obviously at the Library of Congress. In October of 2019, we put our entire archive online. They are all there, almost 90,000 interviews. You just can't see them all as a public-facing user, because we allowed our participants to have some autonomy over how visible their interviews are on the internet. From 2019 on, any interview that's recorded and is uploaded by StoryCorps defaults to a public setting. The participants can change that if they want. We have 2 stricter settings: a StoryCorps community setting, which is internal. You have to log in with an account, or a private interview that's only available to you and your interview partner, but you can share it with a secret link, much like an unlisted YouTube link. And so the majority of those interviews, actually, if you do log in, create a free account and log in, you can see most of that collection, because those interviews from before 2019 defaulted to that internal setting.
That private setting, more private setting.
More private setting, but yes, there are interviews that you wouldn't be able to see without asking for special permission to see. As a researcher, as a journalist, we're working on updating our research agreement right now. We have a partnership in the works that is really exciting, and maybe you'll hear more about, just to give a teaser, but that will allow us to process, I think, more research requests, and then also if anyone would be interested in licensing any of the content, that would go through our communications office.
We can begin to take questions. If someone wants to raise their hand, we'll pass the microphone. But while we're doing that, I'm going to quickly ask Patty, most surprising request you've ever gotten for something from the archive?
Oh, geez. Let me think. There's a funny thing that happens sometimes when people reach out about their StoryCorps interview that they're looking for, and through back and forth conversations come to find out they didn't actually do a StoryCorps interview, but their church or their library or their school did a StoryCorps project. Those can be hard conversations because we don't necessarily have that, but we can direct them back potentially to the organization, and that they might have it. I'm trying to think of something more fun than that. That was the first thing that I thought of.
The website. Thank you all so much. Thank you guys.
Thank you.